Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Annik LaFarge. Annik is an author, photographer, editor, lecturer, and amateur pianist. She has contributed to articles for publications such as the New York Times, Bark Magazine, and HuffPost. And today we will speak about her second book, Chasing Chopin, a musical journey across three centuries, four countries, and half a dozen revolutions. Annik, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to join you. Thank you for having me.
So this is a great traveling experience in music and revolutions and changing political scenarios in different countries, a little bit like today in certain aspects. But I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about yourself. You have lived many lives, and can you just give us a summary of who you are?
Well, I'm a bit of a serial reinventor. I started my career in publishing. I was in the publicity department. Then I worked in the editorial department. Then I took a little break from the book world and went to work at a .com startup that Stephen Brill, who's a sort of serial startup guy in journalism mostly, started, called Contentville, which was a failure. But it was fascinating because it was at the height of the .com era, and we were immersed in the world of technology and content, bringing those two things together. And then I went back into publishing to do more editorial work. And then I started my own consultancy where I worked with authors on the web, which was really helpful to me as a writer, because I think about websites as a way of, in an editorial way, a way of sort of telling a story about a person's intellectual journey and output. And then I started writing books of my own, beginning with a book about the High Line, and then this book about Chopin last year came out in hardcover. It's just out in paperback now.
Wow, yes, that's when I discovered when it was out on paperback. So I guess you have always have this love affair with books and writing and editing.
Yep, that's right. Always. And my mother was an editor and a novelist. My father was a poet. We have a lot of writers in my family. I come from a long family of writers and artists. My great-great-grandfather, John LaFarge, was a very famous stained glass window artist. He was an innovator in that technology that led to Tiffany's work as well. So we have a lot of art and literature in our family.
And I am a part-time photographer. Can you tell us about your journey as a photographer as well?
Yeah, when I was a kid and teenager in high school, growing up in the city, I had a darkroom in my basement. One of my best friends, her father was a professional photographer, and she had one of those box cameras. I had an old, what was then just a 35 millimeter Minolta camera. But we took pictures roving around the city everywhere, and we developed them in our darkroom. And it was always a love of mine. So I graduated later than many people to digital photography, which is what I do now mostly. But I kind of use the camera in a way as a way to look at landscapes, whether they're urban landscapes or rural or mountain or whatever.
And at what stage in your life does the piano comes into the picture?
Well, I don't know if forced is the right word, but I was highly encouraged to take piano lessons as a young person in my probably like the 8th grade, maybe 9th grade. And I didn't like it because I didn't like the teacher. And so I didn't practice, and I got frustrated myself. And then many years later in my early 30s, I started thinking about it again. I always have music in my head. It's just like a constant soundtrack. And I thought I would like to try to get some of it out. And my partner gave me what was then the state-of-the-art keyboard. And this was in the early 2000s, when keyboards were starting to be weighted. The keys were weighted so that they felt more like real pianos. I mean, they still were keyboards, obviously, but they had a more pianistic, physical touch. And I found a really great teacher. And so every lesson began with history and context about the cultural period, the historical period, the musical period that a composer was working in. And it just became this really interesting personal, intellectual, musical project. And I found that practicing every day was like a meditation. It would sort of take me out of myself the way a lot of people meditate.
Okay, I find that almost everyone who tries to learn classical piano falls in love with Chopin, and falls in love. I use that word because from my perspective, I'm not a piano. I don't know anything about piano, but his music seems so romantic. Like if I wanted to play a sonata for a girl that I'm in love with, I will play something by Chopin. So, can you tell us about why is it that in particular you choose Chopin for your book?
Well, Chopin really was, I mean, he was almost not completely, but highly monogamous with the piano. He wrote very little for orchestra, and mostly when he was very young man. But after he got into his 20s and moved to Paris, he pretty much wrote exclusively for the piano. And so, and that's very unusual. Most composers are much more broadly interested in orchestral music and music for different instruments. And so people who play the piano, I mean, Chopin is known to be the poet of the piano. But it's interesting what you say about how romantic he is, because I think that's one of the things that people associate with him, that I mean, I'm not talking about romantic in the sort of the historical cultural meaning of the word, but more in the way you're talking about, when you want to seduce a beautiful woman and you think you're going to turn to Chopin. And I think that's absolutely right. And his music is just, kind of, it's hard to put in words how beautiful much of his music is. But he's also, and this is the thing that I discovered one of the surprises I discovered when I was working on this book and really learning his repertoire more deeply, is that much of his music is really very violent and has a lot of tumult in it. And the piece that I focused on in the work, in my book, the Opus 35 piano sonata, which everybody knows because of the famous funeral march. Bum, bum, ba, 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 ba. We all know that from popular culture, from JFK's funeral, from just the way that we grew up watching cartoons on television. But the middle part, that piece actually takes place in 3 parts, and there's a middle section that's this beautiful elegiac, almost nocturne-like work in a major key, whereas the funeral march and much of the rest of the sonata is in a minor key. And so what Chopin was doing was something that was really very unusual for the time. No one had written a funeral march that had this sort of hopeful, optimistic middle section. First you get the march, then you get the middle section, and then you get the march again. So it's absolutely a piece about death and loss, but it's also a piece about love and optimism. And I think much of Chopin's work is marked by that. Wow. There's a famous piece. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a famous piece, the Fantasy Impromptu, which many people will know from the Judy Garland song, Always Chasing Rainbows. That's the middle section of that piece. It too, my teacher once said he thought that piece was like a hurricane, which I think you can say about the funeral march too, that it's the storm comes, but then there's the eye, and it's this quiet, calm, beautiful moment, and then the storm comes back again. And much of Chopin's music is like that.
Okay, so I discovered that his first composition was at the age of 12, and he died at the age of 39. So I wonder if you could give us the highlights of his life. I mean, whatever, we don't have 3 days to do this podcast. We have limited amount of time, but like for someone who doesn't know much about music, these are point 1, 2, and 3 of his life.
Yeah. Well, of course, many people have written very long books, and it's a very complicated, rich life. But I think one of the really important things about Chopin's life was the fact that he left Poland at a very young age. In his early 20s, he went off to hear the great music around the great musical capitals in Europe. And while he was gone, a revolution, an uprising happened in Warsaw. And it prevented his return, and his friends all encouraged him not to come back to Poland, to go off and write the story of Poland in music, to celebrate the country in a way that only he could do, because he was such a brilliant poet of music. And so he moved to France, and he lived in Paris for the rest of his life. So his life really divides between Poland and France. And his father, in fact, was French and married a Polish woman and moved to Poland. So he has that sort of divided nationality. But throughout his life, there were revolutions all over Europe, and he was someone who, like all people of that time, very buffeted by the political events that were happening. There were pandemics raging across Europe, particularly in the 1830s when he arrived in Paris. There was a big cholera outbreak. And another really important part of the story and his life was the trip that he made to Majorca with his lover George Sand, the great French novelist and sort of personal revolutionary. And so I think that's another. It's important to my story because he worked on the sonata that I wrote about there. But it was also another. It was a sort of a harrowing trip in a lot of ways. It was only 3 months long because the weather turned and he got very sick and had to return to Paris. But he and Sand both did some of their most creative work there and also together in the years that followed. So that was another very important part of his life, was her.
Yeah, and so what can you tell us about, first of all, can you tell us just a little bit more about George Sand? We know she's a writer and she assumes a male name in order to be able to promote her work, because at that time, I mean, even today, there is discrimination against women and their writings and all this and that. But just give us 1 or 2 points about her life herself.
Yeah, I mean, I think she came from an aristocratic family, and she had a very rough early life. She experienced tremendous loneliness and vulnerability. Her father died when she was quite young in a very violent horseback accident. And then her grandmother, who was a very imperious aristocratic woman, basically paid off her mother to go to Paris and leave the young. Her name was Aurore. That was her given name, in the countryside to live with the grandmother and to be raised by the grandmother. And her mother was a commoner and agreed to this deal, this arrangement, which was the first of what became various betrayals in George Sand's life, and it stung her for her entire life. But she completely reinvented herself, and she became liberated and independent at a time when married women were legally the property of their husbands. So yes, she changed her name. She became George Sand. She wore men's clothing, mainly in the beginning so that she could get into the theater, because women weren't permitted into the theaters. She made a bad marriage. Her husband turned out to be a drunk and a womanizer. But even worse, I think not worse, but on another level, he didn't like either animals or music, which were 2 extremely important things to her. So she ended up using the legal system to divorce him, which was pretty much unheard of in those days. So she was someone who just continually reinvented herself and asserted tremendous independence. She also was very dedicated to enabling other artists, and so she turned her house into a place where artists could live and thrive and work together. I found her to be a fascinating character, also very much going against the stereotype that we have of her, the way that Chopin went against the stereotype as I began to learn more about him, of that sort of lonely, tragic, romantic hero. They were both enormously innovative and creative, and in their way very generous people, but I think also extremely difficult. So it's a real volatile combination of traits.
So this, Chopin's life is from 1810 to 1849, so a couple of centuries ago. And there are some technology changes in the piano itself. How does that influence or change the way that Chopin plays?
Well, you can't really talk about the Chopin without talking about the innovations in technology that were happening at that time. And I learned about it, and this became the way that I told the story of the piano in that era, was through this collection in Massachusetts called the Frederick Collection of Historic Pianos, which is a fascinating place that has a collection of about 30 different period pianos going going from the 1790s up to the 1920s. And when you visit them, the married couple that runs the collection, what they do is they play the same works of music on these different pianos. So you really hear the different sonorities. And in the 19th century, there were piano factories everywhere, and there were all over Europe. But the thing that I found most fascinating about this was that countries had their own sounds. And so the people who made pianos in Vienna didn't care what people in New York wanted to hear. They cared about what people in Vienna wanted to hear. And they were also very, they were different. I mean, the brands that Chopin loved, which were Erards and Pleyels, they had a very great dynamic range. Today, we're used to hearing Steinways and Yamahas and Busendorfers that have, what the Industrial Revolution did was sort of smooth out all of the, the great differences to make a big, powerful sound. In the days of the 19th century, when Chopin was composing, pianos had, for instance, the Erard that the Fredericks had. You can hear the bass is very, very deep and rich, and the treble is very like a ringing bell. And it's almost as though the dynamic range is so great that it sounds like two instruments, the right hand to the left hand. And so, Chopin really, he studied the differences between the pianos. Some of them, he loved the Pleyel best of all. You had to work a little harder to get a really great sound on the Pleyel than you did on the Erard, for instance. He talks about that. He says, when I feel like I'm strong and robust, I go for the Pleyel because I can. You know what? I should probably give you the exact quote because he says, when I feel out of sorts, I play on an Erard piano where I can easily find a ready-made tone. But when I feel in good form and strong enough to achieve my own individual sound, I need a Pleyel. So for him, the different instruments had different physical challenges and different sounds that he could get out of them. And that's something that we really don't so much have today, because we have this much more, general sound in the pianos that we hear.
Amazing. So I discovered that you did a lot of traveling and research for this book. Can you tell us about the actual work of doing the research for this book? Where do you travel? You just mentioned this museum where you have all these different pianos. What else you put into this research for this book?
Yeah, I made 2 trips overseas. I wanted to go everywhere where Chopin had worked on the sonata, or places that were important to him during that period. So Mallorca was the first trip that I made. Fascinating.
Poor you.
And I went as late as I could, because he didn't arrive there until rather late in the fall, after the what we think of today as the traditional tourist season. But it was extremely beautiful. It was October. And then I went to France. A couple of years later, I went to Paris, but more importantly to Nohant, which is the central part of France where George Sand had the house that she lived in with her imperious grandmother. And it was just, I'm not a professional musicologist. I'm not a professional musician. I'm a writer by trade. I'm a writer about place. My book about the High Line was really about all the history that is imbued in the landscape around the High Line, sort of peeling back layers of landscape to look at the different historical structures and trends and things that were going on. So it was, obviously everything is completely changed today, but you still are able. For me, it's a way that I tell the story is by being able to be in the place where he lived and worked. And one of the most fascinating parts of this traveling for me, which really helped illustrate a component that I think is really central to both Chopin and Sand and their relationship, is when I got to Nohant, and the woman who was guiding me around showed me the room where Chopin lived. And it was a very noisy house because it was filled with children and servants, and it's all made of stone and tile. And Chopin was very sensitive to noise. I am too, so this really resonated with me. And so George Sand really basically innovated a baffling system, a noise mitigation system, where she took the door and she covered it with horsehair, and she replaced the tile with wood. And she did everything that she could to create a space for him where he could work in peace without being disturbed by this very noisy household. And I just found that really moving, that this was that they were two creative people, two artists who so understood the nature of what that work was and what that work required. And for all the, the kind of difficult things you hear about both of these characters, that to me stands out, and sort of very physically in this house in France stands out as an example of how Sand wanted to enable her fellow artist, and Chopin had this place where he could do this work in the way that he needed to. He had a piano in his room up there, so it was really like a studio.
In the past, I have seen movies about Mozart's life and about Beethoven. And do you know if there are any Hollywood works about the life of Chopin?
There are some movies. And I confess that I haven't. There's one with Hugh. I've forgotten his name, the famous British actor. There was a series that was made on the BBC about George Sand, which is fun to watch, which I did watch. It's very hard to see it. I had to go and watch it in a museum in New York because it's not available anywhere. But I think my sense is that the modern interpretations have not really done either of them justice, to be frank.
I want to put in the show notes 3 pieces that, to your opinion, everyone should be acquainted with about Chopin's work. What would they be?
Oh. Well, that would change depending on the day that you ask me. Lately, I've been listening to a ton of Chopin lately because a couple of weeks ago, they had the preliminaries for the Chopin competition, the big competition that takes place every 5 years in Warsaw. It was postponed from last year because of the pandemic. So a lot of his music is very much in my mind, but the one the piece that I really sort of became almost like a signature for me of the last couple of years is the F minor ballade, which is Opus 47. Sorry, that's the A flat, the A flat ballade. I can't remember the opus number for the F minor, but it's an absolutely it's a journey, the way that so many Chopin pieces are. And there's this thing that happens at the end where it really sounds like it's about to end, and then it starts up again. And I find that so both Chopinesque and so characteristic of this period that we've just been through, where it's just, you think it's ending. And there are, his nocturnes, God, it's hard to even think of a nocturne that would be totally representative, because there's so many. Another piece that I've been listening to a lot, and I write about a lot in the book, is the Opus 9 number 2 nocturne in E flat. And if you listen to some of the newer recordings of it, there were all these variations that were discovered in Chopin's scores. So he kept, and this was very typical of him, he kept editing himself and kept rewriting. And a new edition came out a number of years ago, the Equier edition of all of Chopin's work. It really is the sort of the Urist of Urtext of Chopin. And all of these variations are there. And when you hear them, if you know this work at all, it's a very, very famous piece. It's with the first nocturne that I learned. Most amateurs play it because it's playable. When you hear all these variations, it sounds like jazz. It sounds like it doesn't even sound like Chopin, some of it, and it's really a revelation to hear. So that's another one that I would think of. And just because I've spent an entire 5 years working on the sonata, the Opus 35 sonata, I urge everyone to listen to that, and particularly to listen to the full third movement, which is the funeral march, the famous funeral march. When I first heard it, what knocked my socks off was that modulation in the middle of it. this idea, this piece that we all think we know, this very famous, iconic funeral march that has this entirely different narrative storyline embedded in it. And it really is quite extraordinary when you're listening to it, to hear that striking contrast where you get into this major key lullaby, really, in the middle of a funeral march. It's very Chopin-esque.
So you just said that some of his sonatas are playable. What does that mean? That means that people have a hard time playing, or
his music is very, 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 very hard.
Okay.
I remember when I first sat down on the piano bench with my teacher, and I said my goal was to be able to play all of Chopin's nocturnes, because that's the music that just always spoke to me. I saw him suppress a guffaw. He didn't. He's a lovely man, and he did not. And he just said, "Okay, sit down, let's start," because he knew that there was no way that I was ever going to be able to play all of it. And I can't play the whole sonata. It's very, very hard. But I can play the third movement, and I can play a great deal of Chopin. Many of the preludes and the etudes and the. But you have to work extremely hard to be able to play it, and extremely hard to be able to play it well, because it requires very, very, Chopin, one of the things that was fascinating about him was that he was a great innovator in teaching technique. And he studied very deeply the whole anatomy that we have, the shoulder and the arm and the elbow and the wrist and the fingers and the way that they all work together. And his technique, if you read particularly the book by Jean-Jacques Agaldinger about Chopin as a pianist and teacher, you understand what it was that he told his students about how to play. These are techniques that we now know today. We have a language about carpal tunnel syndrome and about repetitive stress. Chopin understood all of that. And he created a technique of physically playing that would enable a beautiful tone. And so you have to be able to play with great technique in order to play Chopin well.
Wow. And yet, despite how difficult it is to play Chopin, I know that many beginner piano students start with Chopin.
Yes, I think that's right. And there are some pieces that are not for a beginner. I can't think of anything in Chopin that's really playable by a real beginner. But it's always, I think it's a goal of most pianists to be able to play, particularly the favorite works, like the Opus 9 No. 2 Nocturne.
Well, Annik, I think you have taken us into a musical journey. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work?
Well, I built a companion music site that goes chapter by chapter and contains a link to usually a YouTube link to every piece of music that I write about in the book, organized by chapter with page numbers included. So as you read the book, you can easily toggle back and forth on a phone or a computer or whatever. And the address of that is whychopin.com, WHY Chopin.com. The title of the book is Chasing Chopin, a musical journey across, I always have to get the book to remember because it's a very long subtitle, yes. A musical journey across 3 centuries, 4 countries, and a half dozen revolutions. And it's just out in paperback, available wherever books are sold.
Thank you so much, Annik.
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to talk with you.